from Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide. Welcome to special coverage of the 2024 CNN presidential debate. Alongside Kailey, Leinz, I'm Mathieu.
The stage is set in Atlanta, Georgia. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump squaring off for the first time since 2020, each hoping to prove to the nation that they belong back in the White House.
Same candidates, but new rules tonight. No studio audience, and the debaters' microphones will be automatically muted when it is not their turn to speak.
The debate will last for 90 minutes with 2 commercial breaks starting in 1 hour. But our coverage begins right now with our correspondent David Gura, who joins us on the ground from the spin room in Atlanta in moments. Joe, he will be live with a special guest, but we do have to mark how momentous this moment is in history. The first time we have ever seen both a current and former president sharing the debate stage. And for the first time, these two have met since 2020.
Yeah, in this case, they know each other pretty well. They've both had a chance to debate, and a lot has changed, Kailey, in the last 4 years since we both saw them on stage together. As we just mentioned, different rules tonight, different scenario with no audience in the room. This will be new for both of them.
It absolutely will. And of course, they will be limited in the time in which they could speak. 2-minute answers. They will have a minute for rebuttal. Further time to speak will be at the discretion of the moderators. But that is going to add a very interesting dynamic to this debate. Indeed. We want to go live now to the spin room where David Gura, Bloomberg's correspondent, is joining us with a special guest and a surrogate for the Biden campaign. David.
Great to speak with both of you. I'm here with Congressman Jasmine Crockett of the 30th District in Texas. She's a surrogate for President Joe Biden. Thank you very much for being here.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you, first of all, what you're looking for tonight. You are crisscrossing this country, spreading the message of the Biden campaign. What do you want to hear? What do you want to see from these candidates tonight?
So what I want the American people to see is the Joe Biden that I know. The loving man who has worked really hard for this country, really the vast majority of his life. The last, I won't go into how many years, but a very long time, because I don't want to emphasize that. But I also want people to see that he is beyond competent. He's competent and he's compassionate versus the alternative, who is nothing but a con man who is continuously conning his way through life. It's how he ended up becoming the big millionaire that he puts on to be is by conning people. He conned his way into the White House, and I want the American people to say, oh, we can see a con a mile away, and that's you, Donald Trump, and we don't want you anymore.
People are going to be watching this debate to see the candidates. They're going to be looking, I imagine, for some scattered substance throughout this as well. There were so many topics that these moderators could ask about. I think about the district you represent in Texas, immigration, a huge issue there. What can we expect, or what would you like to see these candidates talk about when it comes to that issue in particular?
I would like to, number one, make sure that the president outlined that he worked in a bipartisan way to come up with an actual policy solution. Because when we deal with immigration, this is something that should come through legislation, which means that it should come through the House, the Senate, and then be signed into law. It should not be handled with an executive order. That is only a Band-Aid. That is not a solution. And so this president, who understands legislation, tried to do that. So I want him to lay out the fact that he was working in the way that government to work, which is collaboratively. And it was Donald Trump that shut it down. So I want them to call Donald Trump out about that. And I want him to be able to explain, what did you have that you saw was problematic with this legislation? And I can guarantee you, this guy doesn't have legislative chops. He has no idea what was in that legislation. And the only thing that he saw was the possibility of a win for President Biden.
I got to imagine when you're back home or in other cities talking to voters, the economy comes up, and maybe there's a disconnect between how they're feeling about the economy and what the data are telling them. What's your message to them? What is the president's message to them about the state of this economy now, and indeed what his plans are if he were to get elected again?
Yeah, so I think that we've been speaking a couple of different languages. We say economy, and here recently I said, let's break down what that means to different people. When we talk about economy in our little bubble, we're talking about the joblessness numbers. We're talking about the GDP. We're talking about what's happening in the stock market. But when you're talking to everyday people, they're talking about housing costs. They're talking about food costs. They're talking about the cost of making sure that they have childcare for their kids. These are things that this president understands. That's exactly why there was a $300 monthly per child tax credit that was being given out so that people could be brought out of poverty. We know specifically African-American child poverty was cut in half with that child tax credit. But that was when he had a House that would actually govern and work with him. Obviously, we've got nothing but a clown show under the Republicans. And I want people to realize that that is a prelude to what it would be if he ended up in the White House. But this president understands on the housing point that he has a plan. He wants to make sure that there is a stimulus that can be given to people because these interest rates that he didn't set, these interest rates are really high, but he wants to help people get into the home. So the president understands that there's more work to do, and that's exactly why we need to re-elect him.
Congresswoman, thank you very much. Appreciate the time.
So
This is Jasmine Crockett, Congressman from Texas, joining me here in the spin room ahead of that presidential debate scheduled to start at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. Joan Kailey, back to you.
David Gura, we thank you so much for the conversation. To get us rolling here, we're going to check in with David throughout the hour in the spin room ahead of our debate tonight and after. We'll also be hearing from Donald Trump supporters who are in the room now. But first, it's our political panel. Rick Davis, Republican strategist, partner at Stone Court Capital, along with Democratic strategist Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions. Would love to hear from both of you. Welcome to our special coverage. It's great to have you both here. Jasmine Crockett says we're talking two different languages when it comes to the economy, Kristen. That's going to be the number one issue that we likely hear about tonight. Which language is Joe Biden going to speak?
I think he's going to have to speak about what she was talking about, the second language. I mean, there's a reason why she is very good at communicating with her constituents, and I think that they need to talk more about. And we talk about the joblessness numbers and how successful the president has been in that way, but you have to talk to what people are dealing with in their daily lives, and so he's going to have to get through to people. What are they thinking about when when they're feeding their kids? And she talked about childcare. That's a huge issue right now. So he's going to have to start talking more about that. And I think he's done a good job going across the country and doing that so far. Tonight is a good opportunity for him on this huge national stage to reiterate that he really is feeling it, because he is the person of the people. I mean, as opposed to Donald Trump, who he's had, golden handcuffs or whatever you want to call it his whole life, and does not, I don't believe, understands, what people are feeling when it comes to those types of things.
Well, even if he may not, in your mind, understand it, he certainly is capitalizing on what people are saying they're feeling, which is negative about the economy. And our understanding is, Rick, tonight he plans to hit Joe Biden pretty hard on that. It's one thing, though, to say Biden's economy is bad. It's another to say, I know how to fix it. Does Donald Trump have to get specific with that economic policy tonight?
Well, I think we're going to hear once, if we don't hear 25 times, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago under my administration? Because that's what comes screaming out of focus groups of young black men in Atlanta suburbs when they're asked about who they're going to support. And they say, I think I'm going to vote for Donald Trump because I had more money in my pocket 4 years ago than I do today. Now, there's a lot of things to unwrap in that one statement, but all of a sudden, Donald Trump is getting a higher percentage of black vote than any Republican for president since Ronald Reagan. So there's a phenomena occurring out there, and I don't think it's going to be missed on the Trump campaign.
If they thought again about 4 years ago, there was nowhere to go spend your money because we were in lockdown during a pandemic. Family members were dying, Rick. Does Joe Biden need to remind them of that?
It'll be interesting if he goes there, because right now, from all the pollsters I've talked to, nobody thinks about COVID as part of this campaign. They don't think in terms of what happened to the economy. It's almost like amnesia, that they've decided, I'm going to forget about that period of time. It's the first 3 years in the Trump administration, and I'm comparing to these 3 years of the Biden administration.
We have to consider as well, as we're now less than an hour from these two men taking the stage, their respective podiums, and starting to debate each other, the way in which the bar has been set for them. This is a 78-year-old in Donald Trump and an 81-year-old in Joe Biden. And if you look at polling, at least the polling that came out from the New York Times and Siena College yesterday, Kristen, the majority of voters thought Trump would perform very or somewhat well in the matchup, 60%. Only 46% said the same about Biden. Does he have the lower bar to jump over tonight, or is that bar just kind of embarrassingly low?
I think that the interesting thing is that Trump has actually helped him set that bar that low. And I'll go back to what I was saying before. Trump does a very good job of telling people what to be afraid of. He does a very good job of telling people how horrible America is and what they should be scared about. He does not do a good job of giving people hope and coming up with ideas, particularly with regarding the economy. Right? We saw last week where Trump kind of lobbed across this idea about getting rid of the federal income tax altogether and just increasing tariffs, which would disproportionately impact everyday Americans. That's something he either didn't know or did not care.
All right, well, we'll get more into tax policy this hour, to be sure. Rick and Kristen are going to be sticking with us throughout the duration of our special coverage, and we'll continue it coming up in just moments. The coverage we are giving you of the CNN presidential debate right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I don't know if the election's decided, but I think it could be a big moment for both candidates. I think the debate is a major time to show steady leadership, knowledgeable leadership versus chaos and narcissism.
Both these people have changed a lot in the last 4 years, and they've had a lot of new information given to them. So I'm looking for more than people think in this debate. But I think you're going to have enough exchange, and they hate each other enough so that the vitriol will keep you awake.
Who got a moment? Who had a moment, something happened, positive or negative, that people will be talking about at work or in the grocery store aisle or over the back fence? And the little 8 or 10% of people that are really undecided, they don't read, watch, listen to news. They're not Bloomberg watchers.
They may not tune in live to the debate, but they will absolutely see snippets and excerpts from people who are often translating that information for younger audiences. He has to speak to those things, and whether or not they tune in that day, they will see excerpts, they will see clips, and he doesn't want to be made into a meme.
We need a president in this 2024 election who is focused on addressing all of the concerns that people have, recognizing those that have the greatest immediacy, certainly, but also recognizing that, yes, part of this is about approach, how someone seeks to govern and how someone seeks to lead.
That was Democratic Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger of Virginia joining us earlier today live from Capitol Hill on Balance of Power. Welcome back to Balance of Power, special coverage of the CNN presidential debate live on Bloomberg TV and radio this evening. And joining us now live is Democratic Congressman Wiley Nickel of North Carolina, who is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Congressman, welcome to Bloomberg. Thank you so much for being with us. You obviously represent a district in North Carolina that Joe Biden is going to be visiting tomorrow. Right after the debate, he takes his spin to your home state. What does he need to say on that stage tonight and drive home tomorrow to secure not just your district, but the purple state of North Carolina?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's great news for North Carolina. It's clear that the road to the White House runs through North Carolina. So we're excited to welcome Joe Biden. You know, I think the voters are going to hear the things that we need to hear right now. A president
which are
focused on protecting the right to vote, protecting the right to choose, making sure we do the things we need to do to build an economy for the middle class from the ground up. Those are the things that I think we'll hear a lot tonight about and tomorrow.
The Biden campaign has taken out ads across the country, including in your district ahead of this visit tomorrow, including a full-page ad in USA Today. Trying to draw the contrast, it says the choice, a convicted criminal who's looking out for himself or a president who's fighting for you. But, Congressman, the latest numbers from Siena College New York Times find 2/3 of voters don't seem to care, or at least won't be basing any voting decisions on Donald Trump's guilty verdict. Is this message a waste of time?
I think the message that matters is, you know, Democrats like me want to beat Trump at the ballot box. That's the place where, you know, despite all of the court, you know, convictions that Trump has had, the message is who's going to do the best job for the American people? Who's going to work in a bipartisan way? That's, you know, I represent a purple state and a purple district. I want folks willing to work across the aisle. Joe Biden has demonstrated that he's a president who wants to do that, is willing to do that. Trump is in it for himself. I frankly just think he's trying to stay out of jail. That's a big motivation for his campaign. But, you know, there's a huge contrast. We're going to see it tonight. And for the folks who are, you know, you talk about the polls, people just aren't paying attention. The folks I represent, they're focused on their kids getting out of school, what they're going to be doing for the summer. This tonight is the first real, you know, start to this campaign. And I think you're going to see very different polling after this debate tonight.
Well, and people may get some actual policy outlined by both candidates this evening. On the subject from policy, I know some policy you care deeply about and have been working on in your time in Congress is crypto legislation. There is a prevailing notion, and I speak with a lot of people in the crypto industry, that Donald Trump would be a better president for crypto, more supportive of innovation, less stringent in the regulatory sense. Can you honestly tell me if a crypto question is asked tonight that Joe Biden will give a better answer than Donald Trump?
I hope a crypto question is asked tonight. I'm not betting on it, but I think the point that I want to make on that is Donald Trump was president for 4 years. He didn't do anything for crypto, So I don't take the stuff Donald Trump says and the stuff he does are very different. Now I agree, Gary Gensler's horrible. The SEC is really out of step with the rest of the Biden administration. But the softening of the approach from the White House is something we've been tracking a lot in the last few weeks. And I think you're going to see a lot more, a very thoughtful approach to Web3 and crypto from the Biden campaign and the White House in the coming weeks and months.
It's great to have you at the desk as part of our special coverage, Congressman. Welcome back to Bloomberg.
Great to be with you in real life, in person.
Well, that's right. In real life, we're real people. We'll be watching this debate together. Coming up, Democratic Congressman Wiley Nickel of North Carolina at the table on Bloomberg. Earlier this evening, we spoke with New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, who is now supporting Donald Trump after earlier this cycle, of course, being one of the most powerful surrogates for Nikki Haley, as he talked about right here on Bloomberg. He talked to us again today. We started by talking about his expectations for the former president.
I think he is going to rein it in. I think Biden is going to have more energy than people think. I think Trump is going to have a little more professionalism, if you will. See, if he gets frustrated by Biden, who is effectively the old man, it's past his bedtime. If that guy is getting under your skin, then it's going to show a real weakness. Now, I think he's going to get a little frustrated and a little blustery with the moderators. I think if there's any attack, I think it's going to be with the moderators because, will they shut his mic off? I think he would actually like it if they shut his mic off a couple times, so he can kind of play that victim. Oh, they wouldn't let me speak. They wouldn't let me have my say. So I think that. If he shows chaos with Biden as opposed to just trying to stay above him, I think that's a weakness for him, if anything. And then, of course, as they get into the issues, as opposed to the traditional reality TV stuff, Trump is going to have to come with specifics. You can't just say inflation's bad. It is. It's awful. It's crushing families. But you got to come with solutions. People want change, so you got to show the change you're going to bring them. Whether it's a better opportunity with energy costs, a more of a free market in healthcare costs, quantitative tightening. I don't know. He's got to come with something. Getting rid of all the folks at the Fed. He's got to come with something that says, on day one, I'm doing this to make your costs, your availability of funds to actually pay the rent and bring, again, put food on the table. This is what I can do for you. And if he can do that, then people see him as that change agent, and he can be successful in November.
They're both going to talk about their plans to bring down prices. Governor, does Donald Trump make himself vulnerable to attack by Joe Biden with this tariff idea?
Potentially. And again, he has to remember, both candidates have to remember, they're not talking to Wall Street insiders. They're not talking to Congress. Right. They're just talking to average Americans, and they're going to have a very large audience. So even if you get to the word tariff, you got to explain what this stuff means. And people just want to know, am I going to sleep at night because I don't have as high credit card bills, and you're going to help me bring prices down and under control? And how does that actually work? So there's got to be a little bit of a simplification, because these can be very complicated economic issues. So if he can do that, and he's always had a pretty good connection with people, a pretty good ability to kind of explain those types of things. If he stays lofty, he's in trouble. If he can bring it down to a real level and show that it won't be inflationary if they try to attack him on that, because if he can't show that, then he's in trouble, and he probably shouldn't bring it up, because the economic issue is all about the high costs of living. Even the word inflation, everyone knows what inflation is, of course, but even that is a lofty word, right? He's got to take this opportunity to literally talk to the American people, right? Make that connection that he did in 2016. He lost in 2020, but if he gets down just a very real level and kind of works through those issues, what immigration means to their family, what he's going to do on inflation for their family, how he's going to get a free market back into healthcare costs, which are a huge part of the inflationary problem right now. If he can talk at that real level, he's going to make some progress.
Republican Governor Chris Sununu of New Hampshire, not in Atlanta, but talking with us today on Bloomberg. Back with us, our political panel, Rick Davis and Kristen Hahn. Rick, you were with us in New Hampshire for the First in the Nation primary, and you brought us to this event at the Snowshoe Club up in Concord, New Hampshire, in the snow, in a barn in the middle of nowhere. The Sununu supporters, the Nikki Haley supporters were there that night. It was the old line establishment New Hampshire Republicans. Are they even watching this? What does Donald Trump say to them?
Yeah, I think that he won't be talking directly to them, because the reality is he has to depend upon the GOP, that group of voters who weren't for him in the primary, but have since liked Governor Sununu, endorsed him. And he's got to just assume they're going to come on board because it's too much effort for him to try and convince them while he's trying to chase these independent voters, the Hispanic voters that are coming his way, the young black male voters coming his way, and all these angry double haters. I mean, like, there's just only so much that the campaign can do. And I'm sure they've done triage. And if we're talking to Republican voters in New Hampshire, this late stage of the game, we're in deep trouble. Wow. So they have to assume that what they're going to see tonight is a Donald Trump that they can say, you know what, I can't have Biden, so I'm going with him. But his personality, his behavior is the issue. And I think age is the issue for Biden. Behavior is the issue for Trump. So that's the one thing that could actually cause a problem for that constituency.
Well, as we talk about Republicans consolidating around Donald Trump, polling does suggest, Kristen, that more Republicans are for Trump than Democrats at this point are for Biden. The base, the coalition that elected him in 2020 seems to be fracturing, whether it's minority voters or young voters. Does he try to speak more to them tonight or try to get the Nikki Haley voters on board?
I think you've got to talk to all of them. But going back to the Democrats, if you look historically, this is what we do. We have our fights, we have conversations, we have the more liberal of us, like peeling off. And at the end of the day, I firmly believe everybody's going to come home. They're going to come home. They're going to look at the alternative. They're going to look at, Biden may not have done every single thing that they want. He's been very bipartisan at times. He's been more progressive at times. So he's not made every single person in the party happy. But ultimately, generally, people come home, particularly when you're looking at Donald Trump,
All right, Kristen Hahn and Rick Davis will be sticking with us as we continue our special coverage of the CNN presidential debate right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Like many, I look forward to hearing Donald Trump lay out his vision for the country. It's a positive vision. It's a forward vision. He is excited. I expect that you're going to see a sharp contrast between President Trump's positive agenda and Joe Biden's proven weakness. It doesn't matter if he drinks a whole gallon of energy drinks. He's not going to be able to match the acumen and the readiness of Donald Trump.
That was House Speaker Mike Johnson laying out his expectations for tonight's debate, where the acuity and temperament of Joe Biden and Donald Trump will be front and center. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio's special coverage of the CNN presidential debate. Joining us now from the Spin Room in Atlanta is Bloomberg Opinion's Nia-Malika Henderson. So, Nia, we just heard from the speaker there ideas of energy, which begs the question, as much as here at Bloomberg we want to talk about policy and substance, is that what tonight is really about?
No, it's really about presentation and about performance. And listen, historically, debates have been about that, right? Because if you think about what's going to happen, we're going to see these two candidates. People are very familiar with the president and the former president, and they are going to mainly digest this in clips. They're not necessarily going to sit and watch for 90 minutes. But listen, millions of Americans obviously will. And if you're Joe Biden, you are going in knowing that millions of Americans have questions about your age, right? If you're Donald Trump, you're aware that millions of millions of Americans have questions about your temperament, right? And so you go in tonight, if you're these two candidates, the president and the former president, thinking about that, how to overcome some of those weaknesses, change minds, bring some folks back to the party who may have strayed and maybe looking for a third party candidate. So, the task is tall for both of these candidates. I, in some ways, think it's taller for Biden because he does seem to be lacking in some of these polls, right? If you look at the swing state polls, he is behind in most of these swing state polls. It's tight, but he has consistently been behind. So he's got to change the trajectory. He's got to knit together that coalition. He's got to figure out how to also bring some of those Trump to Biden voters that we saw in 2020 back to his column.
Nia,
so we'll see.
Nia, we've only got a minute. Be honest with us about what's going on in the room there.
Yep.
Politico is calling it the saddest spin room. Jasmine Crockett was with us at the top of the hour. Where are the troops for Joe Biden?
Yeah. Yeah, they have sent down sort of a scaled down roster of folks. One of those people, obviously, Jasmine Crockett. This is what they wanted to do for whatever reason. So you see behind me, not a lot of activity, and we'll see what it is like after the actual debate, what kind of spinmeisters are here and what they're saying. But it isn't your typical spin room, that's for sure.
What an exercise. Bloomberg Opinions, Nia-Malika Henderson. We're glad you're there for us, Nia. It's great to see you as we get ready for the debate itself. Special coverage of the CNN presidential debate continues here on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Bloomberg.
We have a lot of people coming. There's a lot of interest, tremendous interest in the debate. And, you know, when you say prep, I think this is prepping. These people know better than anybody what they want.
Have you decided who your vice president is?
In my mind, yeah.
Do they know?
No, nobody knows.
Former President Donald Trump speaking to reporters last weekend. Trump has reportedly skipped traditional debate prep ahead of the event, which takes place just about half an hour from now. And joining us from the spin room down in Atlanta, Georgia, where this all is going down on Bloomberg TV and radio, is Bloomberg's David Gura. So, David, we heard Trump there saying that he does in his mind know who his vice president is. And certainly there are many vice president wannabes that are present in Atlanta this evening.
There are, and there's a watch party taking place at the former Senator Kelly Loeffler's house here in Atlanta, at which those kind of four frontrunners, including Tim Scott, J.D. Vance, are expected to be in attendance. He's going to go to that party afterward. He has teased leading up to this debate that he could make an announcement soon. No indication of when that might be. It's all part of the spectacle or the show of it. But yes, they're here as his surrogates, and if you look behind me, the crowd is fairly thin, but we've had Corey Lewandowski, his former campaign manager here, Ralph Reed, the prominent evangelical political figures here as well, and Byron Donalds of Florida, the congressman who's a supporter of Donald Trump, here sort of sharing their message of support for the former president. And then on the other side, you've had Jasmine Crockett, from whom we heard a little bit earlier, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. So it isn't a steady sort of flow of these surrogates coming through, but we have had sort of peppered with people coming through ahead of the debate, guys.
At what point do we actually see the candidates here, David? Is it not until they come out on the stage? There's no testing the podiums or getting a walkthrough on the stage tonight?
Not that I think that we're not going to see that. So we're at some geographic remove. We're here in the basketball arena on the Georgia Tech campus, so a spin arena, not just a spin room. And then the studio is near here, but still a ways away. And of course, there's no audience that's going to be in there. So there's a lot of CNN programming originating from where I am, and a lot of CNN broadcast televisions around the arena. But no, I don't think that we're going to get any sort of advanced look at the candidates. We did see them each get off their respective airplanes and make their way to Atlanta, to the site of this debate. But no, I think we're going to get no glimpse of it until 9 o'clock when the debate begins in earnest.
And of course, you're going to see that live as it happens here on Bloomberg TV, and you'll hear it on Bloomberg Radio. David Gura live in Atlanta. We thank you, David. We'll check back in with you shortly as we reassemble our political panel, spending the evening watching this debate with Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, and Kristen Hahn, partner at Rock Solutions. Rick, we're a half hour out. You've prepared presidential candidates for this very moment. What are they going through right now in their quarters, wherever they are behind stage?
Yeah, last minute makeup. I mean, there's a lot of little things that have to happen. Usually it's the spouse coming in to, say good luck and, here's where I'll be sitting. I don't know what the arrangements are going to be since there's no studio audience for family members and people like that. But, it tends to be very quiet at this point, right? Everybody is just trying to lower the temperature. No more talk about favorite slogans or what kind of punch we're going to try and throw tonight. It's all about just putting the candidate in a nice, comfortable mood. Mm-hmm. And they're usually very nervous, right? They're usually uptight by now. This is a big moment. This is probably the most important 90 minutes in this entire campaign. Wow. Because everything else is scripted but this. And so I think you can expect them to be trying to get themselves psyched up in the best way they know how. These are two people who've seen it all, so they know what's best for themselves.
Yeah, Joe Biden's been debating for decades, something Donald Trump has been pointing out in the lead up to this as everybody tries to set the bar for themselves. Obviously, a lot of preparation has been done leading up to tonight, and yet circumstances change in real time, Kristen, even today, as the Supreme Court, for example, hands down a number of decisions, one of them a confirmation of what Bloomberg broke yesterday, allowing emergency abortions in Idaho to continue for now. We know that Joe Biden has planned on hitting Trump on the abortion issue hard this evening. Does that message have to be tweaked, at least on the margin, in light of not just this court ruling, but the mifepristone ruling from 2 weeks ago?
No. I mean, at the end of the day, this was not a good day for pro-choice individuals. It's not. People in Idaho and across this country still are subjected to these laws that are causing harm to women's bodies. So these women in Idaho and other places still have doctors that are having to make these decisions, fearing for, they could go to jail. When is it the life of the mother? When is it, or it's just she's so sick? And what's that line, right? And this is still an issue. So, nothing good happened today. As much as the Republicans want to spin this as some sort of win, it is not. I think, you saw that the president has put out a new ad that will be airing during the debate, during the commercial breaks, on this issue and other issues. So, no, full steam ahead on this issue.
So Joe Biden will say this is still an urgent matter, a call to action. What will Donald Trump say about it tonight?
Look, I think Donald Trump is going to paint a country in disarray. He's going to focus on the fact that only he can make America great again, the slogan. And I think that he will say that, this is all about the states. I've given the power back to the states. If it weren't for the people I put on the Supreme Court, the federal government would be telling you how to handle yourself in this issue, and I'm going to let the states decide this. And, of course, that will then cover over this decision today, which was basically, no, the states can't just make the decisions in a vacuum.
How about that?
So I think that as much as he can, he'll want to try to confuse people as to what his position is on abortion, because if he takes any one position on it, he's either going to upset his base, which he has a great potential to do, because they don't like the fact that the states are doing this. They want a federal law. Or he'll upset, potential women voters in suburbs that he desperately needs who have a more liberal view of abortion than he does.
All right, Rick Davis and Kristen Hahn are going to be staying with us. Coming up, we'll also hear from Ben Carson, former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. That's next on our special coverage of the CNN presidential debate right here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio, where we're bringing you special coverage of the CNN presidential debate, which is slated to start just over 20 minutes from now. Joining us now as we walk up to the big event, Bloomberg senior national political correspondent Nancy Cook. Nancy, as we speak, Joe Biden is active on social media, now touting a secret sauce that you can buy for $4.60. The secret to a debate performance, staying hydrated, saying the same performance enhancers Joe Biden took before going on stage is 100% water, zero malarkey, clearly trying to have some humor about what has been circling among Trump and his surrogates, suggestions that Joe Biden has to have some kind of performance enhancer to be up to the job tonight. All of that is part of the pre-debate spin, if you will.
I think that what Joe Biden has actually been doing is he's just been resting at Camp David and practicing with his advisors and doing mock debates. But yes, this has been part of a narrative that Republicans have tried to spin really this whole election, that Joe Biden is too old to be president, that he's feeble in some way. And you have to remember it's an interesting strategy because, Trump and Biden are actually only 3 or 4 years apart. Trump is in his late 70s, Biden in his early 80s. They're both older men and the oldest presidential candidates in history. And so I'll be looking for how they both handle just the rigors of being on the debate stage for 90 minutes, having no verbal gaffes, what their energy levels look like, and how they present themselves.
These two now have something in common. Remember Trump Ice? Now they can both say they've sold bottled water. Maybe that's the one common ground we've found tonight. Donald Trump did this, though, to Hillary Clinton, didn't he? Remember suggesting that she wasn't physically capable to do the job, the videos of her being unstable, took on a life of their own on social media, suggested she was on drugs. We've heard this before.
Absolutely. I mean, he will really go after his opponents in any way possible. And we saw that throughout the Republican primary. I mean, he and his team went after Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, Nikki Haley, the former governor of South Carolina, in pretty vicious terms, with nicknames, belittling them, sort of releasing memos day in and day out, calling out all their flaws. And now his attention has turned to Joe Biden. And so I think that we can expect the RNC to pull clips of Biden if there's any mistakes tonight. It will be a full court press to try to really put Biden on the defensive.
Well, and he'll likely put Biden on the defensive over policy as well. What issues should we expect Donald Trump to focus on most heavily this evening?
So I think he's going to focus most heavily on immigration and the economy. I do think that, there's some debate about how much he's going to bring up Hunter Biden and the fact that Hunter Biden is also a convicted felon like Donald Trump. But I think that bringing up some of the family stuff is also a way to try to get under Biden's skin. Sure. And, really try to get him to react.
Well, so is that his posture tonight? Get personal, get Biden to be the one with the temperament issue? Or is Donald Trump going to show up, try to school the president on policy, surprise everyone?
I think that what Trump is going to try to do is appear presidential and as presidential as possible. I think that is what.
So no Hannibal Lecter, electric sharks tonight.
I mean, if his advisors have their way, which granted Trump is going to be the only one up there on the stage, he will appear presidential. He will stick to talking a lot about the economy. And he will, try to really, not go on rambling speeches, not talk about sharks or windmills or, any of the things that he sometimes goes on tangents about.
How about 2020? Rigged.
Yeah, that is not something that his advisors want him to bring up. They don't want to bring up the fact that he still thinks the election is stolen. They do not want him to get into some sort of match about what happened on January 6th. They really want to stick to the policy areas where they think Biden is vulnerable.
All right, Bloomberg's Nancy Cook, thank you so much for joining us. And remember, to all our listeners and viewers, if you're a Bloomberg Terminal customer, you can follow our reporters' live coverage this evening of the debate on T-Live Go on the Bloomberg Terminal. Now, earlier today in Atlanta, Democratic Governor Gavin Newsom of California, a surrogate for Joe Biden, spoke with Bloomberg. Here's a piece of that conversation.
Trump's strategy and approach to a tariff framework, 10% on $3.1 trillion of imports, 60% on tariff on China imports. I mean, that's catastrophic from an inflationary perspective, mass deportations, all those issues, comparing to a strategy that's well established by the Biden administration. I hope to hear a lot about that tonight.
Let me ask you about this gap between the economic data and how people are feeling about the economy. How does he make inroads doing that? How does President Biden do that?
It's just an extraordinary thing. I mean, the 15.6 million jobs have been created just in 3.5 years by the Biden administration. It's more than 8 times more than the last 3 Republican administrations combined.
We did have a pandemic.
Yeah, well, we did have a pandemic, but we also had a pandemic that you compare and contrast the years prior, even with the Trump years. Black unemployment now lower than it's ever been. Hispanic unemployment lower than it's ever been. Women unemployment lower than it's ever been. And that same pandemic led to inflationary pressures that are perhaps the answer to your question as to why that disconnect between performance and perception and why people feel different than the data as it relates to the cumulative impacts of inflation.
This is a president who talks a lot about the fate of democracy, the future of democracy. Do you think that that's resonating with your constituents in California, people across this country?
It should. I mean, he hasn't been shy about his intention. Nor has he been shy about associating himself with blueprints like that Project 2025 plan. I mean, that should scare the daylights out of anyone. I mean, that's about rights regression. That's about rolling back all the progress last half century. It's about American reverse, a pre-1960s world. Women's rights, LGBTQ rights, obviously issues related to voting rights, civil rights. So, no, I think the issue of democracy, autocracy, the sort of dictatorial rhetoric, the authoritarian rhetoric that Trump is advancing, the fact that he's even joking about another term, suspending the Constitution, even out of context, I get that, but even talking about dictatorship, that should be very seriously considered by folks out there that care about their kids and grandkids and the fate and future of this country.
This is a debate about, hopefully, substance. There'll be style as well, people looking to see how these two individuals look, interact with one another, with the moderator as well. I talked to a lot of people who may support the president but aren't excited about supporting the president. Yeah. How does he combat that? How do you, as a surrogate for him, work to improve that?
ideas should matter more. I mean, the fact that you delivered on the Chips and Science Act, and we're bringing back manufacturing in the United States of America, addressing supply chain concerns, the infrastructure work that's happening all across the United States, not just in blue states, red and rural parts of the United States, the fact that we have an industrial policy, the fact that we're seeing the investments, historic investments in clean energy, and we're seeing historic investments in domestic energy production, now more energy independent than any time in our lifetime. All of that should excite people. A vision for the future around low carbon green growth, a vision for the future as it relates to protecting the middle class and advancing the cause of freedom and liberty around the globe. And Leinz, I mean, across all of those spectrums, to me at least, that's enlivening and exciting. I think we attach too much to performance style. I'm into the substance.
California Governor Gavin Newsom, a surrogate for President Biden, speaking with Bloomberg's David Gura there. In the debate spin room earlier this evening, we've got less than 15 minutes until the debate begins, and we're going to have the full show for you here on Bloomberg TV and radio as we reassemble our political panel. Rick Davis and Kristen Hahn with us. Great to have you both along for the ride. Kristen, a lot of Democrats wanted that man to be running for president, maybe be the nominee or the presumptive nominee by now. Did you think, as a Democratic operative, that Joe Biden would be a caretaker, single-term president, and that you would be watching someone like Gavin Newsom tonight?
I think we were all kind of wondering. I mean, it was President Biden's, to have. He wanted it, obviously, and so we all fully are behind the president. I think that he, the governor, is, certainly just a star. And I think a lot of us want to see him go, a lot farther in politics. So hopefully, maybe next time around we'll see him after Biden's second term.
All right, well, we have a long way to go until 2028. We're still trying to get through 2024. And in 2024, we know that a few issues are front and center in this election. We were just speaking with Rick, with Nancy Cook, about the ones that Donald Trump is likely to hit hardest on. We've talked about the economy. The other is immigration and the border. If you were advising Joe Biden as the incumbent president, who therefore owns what's happening at the border to a large extent, does he need to be on offense or defense on that issue tonight?
Yeah, I think there's very little for him to defend. And so I think he has to go on offense and talk about what he plans to do in the second term of his administration. He's got to talk about congressional remedies. He's got to talk about what he can do as president. He's got to talk about stemming the flow of immigrants. He's got to talk about the risks we have inherent in, people from other parts of the world who may want to do harm to the United States coming in through our southern border. I mean, he's got to muscle up on this immigration topic, because we see time and time again that even if he can get by voters on his economic programs, he's getting headlong into immigration as a stopper issue, especially in a lot of the key states like Georgia, like Arizona, like Nevada. Even the blue wall is concerned about immigration. And so he's got a perfect opportunity to try and change the dynamic tonight, but he can't do it on defense. He's got to go on offense.
Pretty interesting to consider the idea of playing offense on the economy if you're Joe Biden. Donald Trump's going to be dangling tax cuts or making permanent tax cuts to voters tonight. Will they hear anything else?
I mean, I think Donald Trump's been a little bit all over the place on taxes, right? We know that he wants to extend his tax cuts. How's he going to pay for them? He can't really talk about debts and deficit. What we do know is that a broad swath of Americans, if you look at the issue, when you talk about the wealthiest Americans paying fewer taxes than everyday Americans, than middle-income Americans, and corporations, big corporations, paying their fair share, that's a message that works. I think you'll hear a lot of that from the president. That's something that resonates with, folks on both sides of the aisle, and also those folks that we're trying to reach, those folks that may not be on either side or, have a candidate yet, and the people who we call swing voters in those important states. So I think you'll hear a lot about it. Donald Trump will try to play all the sides of the issue.
Rick and Kristen are going to stay with us as part of our special coverage. We turn now back to the spin room in Atlanta to speak with a surrogate for former President Donald Trump. That's Dr. Ben Carson, of course, the former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Dr. Carson, it's good to see you again on Bloomberg. Welcome from Atlanta. We talk a lot about shelter costs as a big component of inflation on a daily basis here on Bloomberg. And the Biden administration has put out its plan to lower housing costs for working families. It includes lowering the cost of home ownership through mortgage relief credit, a down payment assistance for first-generation homeowners, lowering closing costs. What's Donald Trump's plan?
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that home ownership is an incredibly important part of the American dream. It's the major mechanism for wealth accumulation is home ownership. So it's a high priority. And during the last Trump administration, we worked very hard to decrease some of the regulatory burden to make homes more available, to decrease the cost, and to look at some alternative factors for determining who was eligible, for instance, for FHA loans. That resulted in the largest number of black homeowners in history. So those are the kinds of things that we need to do. And then recognize that the real cost is the regulations. You heard about the $600,000 units in Los Angeles last week. To build the unit only costs $150,000. But by the time you add all the regulations, you're way up there. This is what we've got to deal with.
Okay, so Dr. Carson, just to be clear, is that what we should expect Donald Trump to outline if he were to actually outline a policy to solve America's housing problem? It's deregulating, or is there something else more specific?
That's going to be a significant part of it, getting rid of a lot of the regulations. You know, we had a very good plan that was hatched and almost ready to go for Los Angeles, working with the mayor there, Garcetti, with the governor, with several other commissioners. And then COVID hit and kind of knocked everything off the table. But it is possible to do these things. There are mechanisms. They interlock and work together to be able to provide the kind of housing that we need for our people.
Dr. Carson, you're one of the former employees, if I can use that term, one of the former officials of the Trump administration who has stuck by Donald Trump. You're back with us now speaking as his surrogate again 4 years later. Are you concerned about the conversation surrounding his temperament? You know Donald Trump better than most people. If he starts talking about Hannibal Lecter tonight or sharks and electric boats in the water, some of the stuff that we've been hearing on the stump lately, how does he connect with voters?
I don't think that's going to be an issue. I think he's going to stick very largely to the issues and also be anxious to compare his administration and his policies with the policies of the current administration. That's the kind of thing that the people need to hear. And the people were set up as the final arbiter on purpose by our founders. And obviously they need to hear the whole story before they can make their decision. And what's been going on is a lot of people, particularly in the media, have been putting their thumb on the scale and maybe not telling the whole truth. And this occurs on both sides, all sides. We need to get back to real integrity so that the people can make the appropriate decisions. They're smart people, but if you don't give them the right information, obviously they're going to make the wrong decisions.
Of course, people is a very generalized term to discuss the American electorate, Doctor. There's many different demographics that we are looking at, including some specifically highlighted in the new New York Times Siena College polling that came out last night that finds 26% of black likely voters supporting Trump compared to 5% at this time in 2020. What do you think is driving that?
Well, I think people have their eyes and their ears open. They saw what happened. You know, the lowest black unemployment on record during the Trump administration, the highest wages, attention to HBCUs, opportunity zones where we encourage a lot of private funding to go into some of the most economically neglected areas, crime, the border. All of these things impact upon people's safety and upon their economic status. And I think people are noticing that and paying attention to it. So you'll see not only our blacks and Hispanics moving toward Trump, but the whole group of every demographic feels the same pain when they go to the grocery store or when they go to the gas pump or when they open their bills and they see the utility bills. It hits everybody in the same way.
All right, Dr. Ben Carson, former U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development and surrogate for Donald Trump, thank you for joining us this evening. Now, as we count down with just 5 minutes to go until the debate begins on CNN, back with us now, our political panel, Rick Davis and Kristen Hahn, here on Bloomberg TV and radio, where we are joined this evening, Kristen, by our global audience. People around the world are getting ready to watch what happens in the next 90 minutes. What does Joe Biden need to say, not just to the American electorate, but to allies and adversaries across the world tonight? How should we expect foreign policy to feature in this debate?
So I think it's interesting because, people don't generally vote on foreign policy. It's important. It does impact us back at home, but people are voting on the domestic issues. That's why we're talking about the economy so much. That's why the surrogates are talking about, can people put food on their table and how much do things cost? But he's the president of the United States, and the rest of the world will be watching. So I think presenting a strong front, making sure that they know that he is a president that's not in bed with Vladimir Putin. He's not going to back down to foreign dictators. And sending that message to everybody else across the world, including our foreign leaders, is important for him.
Well, you know what Donald Trump is going to say? There were no wars, no new wars in my administration. This is the guy behind more endless wars if you reelect him. What should Joe Biden say to that?
Yeah, look, I think Biden's got a hard road to hoe here because I think a lot of the problems that he has in his public image is the debacle that was called the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And, he had a 54% approval rating before that happened. And ever since then, he's been well below that. And so I think he has to be strong. He has to challenge Trump on his relationship with Vladimir Putin. He has to say that supporting Ukraine is a function of, securing a liberal free society that allows trade and commerce to occur. And he's got good examples he can use, but he can't waste a lot of time on that because that's not what's driving the vote. As Kristen said, he's got to be focused on how it affects everybody economically.
Speaking of time, Rick, we have 3 minutes to go until this begins. How many minutes into this debate do they both start to lose the audience at home watching it?
Yeah, look, unlike us, not everybody sticks around for the whole 90 minutes.
Come on.
And so there'll be a lot of curiosity seekers, folks who are not really into politics, who want to see what's going on here. And so I think they've got 30 minutes, maybe 45, to make their case to the American people where maybe there's 80 million people watching, right? By the time you get around to the full hour of the debate, into the last half hour, at most half, if not fewer, will be still watching this debate.
Okay, Quinnipiac tells us 7 out of 10 registered voters are going to be watching this tonight. Massive numbers, to Rick's point. How quickly does Joe Biden need to get to the point? They're not doing opening statements tonight. Important note in the format. We're diving straight into questions.
I mean, I think you have a hard punch right in the beginning, and I think that he will. He's used to this, a hard punch.
Punch him in the face.
Punch him in the face. I think, Trump is going to come out hard, and the president has to look strong as well.
So they're both going to do the same thing.
I think probably they've got a little bit of a different style going on, but yeah, I think he's got to come out of the gate hard, strong, make those points that he wants to right out the front.
How strong do you expect Trump will come out, Rick, knowing that so much has been made about his temperament relative to Biden's demeanor?
Yeah, look, I think he's going to be Donald Trump, right? And so maybe he doesn't just go on and on and on. He doesn't exceed his time. He doesn't immediately attack Joe Biden, but he's going to paint a dark picture of America. It's going to be a scary first couple of minutes of this debate if you're Donald Trump, because you have to create the setting where anything Donald Trump suggests he does is going to be better than what we're currently living under. And so he needs that atmospherics. So expect a very dark opening from Donald Trump.
This next moment is going to be lonely for these two gentlemen, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is really the scary part. What do you do when you go on the stage? You go over and shake his hand, shake Tapper's hand. But at the end of the day, it's a very dislike on that stage between these two candidates. They don't like each other. And so it's not just a sport to them. This is sort of the final countdown to a death row. And I don't think you're going to see a lack of emotion on either part. Remember, it was Joe Biden who threw the hard punch on Proud Boys. Explain your relationship with those guys. So he's not timid either. So this could be a real brawl by the time this is over.
Well, it's just about time to brawl here. We thank our panel. They're going nowhere. They're going to watch and listen to this with us and be back with us on the other side. Rick Davis and Kristen Hahn, a perfect pair for this moment. Kailey, we're going to go through this now for 90 minutes. Again, this is live from Atlanta. And on the other side, we'll have a report from David Gura in the spin room, and we'll be analyzing what we see and hear tonight with our panel.
Yes, we'll have coverage from 10:30 to 11 p.m. after this wraps. The first time a former and current president have debated each other. And the first time these two have shared a stage since 2020 is what we're about to see.
Yeah, let's witness history together now. The CNN presidential debate live on Bloomberg TV and radio.